continue with our teaching. Make sure it stays where it's supposed to be. We're going to continue with our teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. So we're in the book of Matthew, chapter 5. If you brought a Bible or you want to kind of turn to it, we'll get there in just a second. So anyway, I wanted to begin, before we even get to the lesson, I want to pray as we get to the lesson, but before we get to the lesson, I want to go back and be sure that we all have a good understanding of where we are in Jesus' teaching so far. The Sermon on the Mount is an incredible amount of teaching that Jesus did. And what he's telling us is so important. In fact, I've often thought that if you could just kind of pare down, and that was one piece of scripture that you could have, that it would tell us so much of how we should be living our lives. So it's just, there's so much in it. It's so rich that we go too quickly through it, and I think we begin to miss out on some of those things. So let me just do a quick overview of where we are thus far. And on the handout, it's on the table. You can see the part that I'm going to do. Now, we've skipped a little bit because in Kim's, Pastor Kim Kramer's planning, we were going to meet last week, and then Michael Ranston was available. And what I believe, and I could be wrong on this, Kim and I kind of talked about it just briefly. The piece that was supposed to be done last week, he may stick that back on so it come a little out of order, which would be okay. It won't be missed. We're going to jump down today to Matthew 5:38 and all the way through 48. That's what we're going to cover this evening. But before we get to it, I just want to be sure that we're understanding kind of the big picture of what's going on. So this is kind of like a 50,000 foot altitude quick view of where we are thus far. And you know, as you look at the beginning of the chapter back in Matthew 5:1 and 2, that Jesus is taking his disciples, and he sits down with his disciples, and he begins to teach them, is what the scripture says. And then it also indicates that others were there, and they kind of gather around. So try to get that picture of concentric circles. Jesus teaching, his disciples, who he is specifically teaching, and then others listening in. That's kind of the picture that we see. Why is that significant? Why is that recorded for us in Scripture? Here's why I think it's recorded. Because Jesus is teaching his disciples, the 12 that were with him, the 12 that followed him, and today, you and I are his disciples. So this teaching, the whole Sermon on the Mount, is directed to the disciples, the believers, and today it's directed to us, the true church of Jesus Christ. So it's important to us what he's teaching here. It has a direct application to us. So now we jump down just a little bit further. We see in Matthew 5:3-12. This is the section of the teaching that we call the Beatitudes. And this is very important. There's a couple of things I want to make sure that you see in this particular piece of the teaching here. There's four really important principles. The first one is this, and I left you a little space. I didn't leave you much, I know, but a little space if you want to jot it down. The first one is this: Jesus addresses character before conduct. That's very important. He addresses character before conduct, and that's how we should be living our lives today. We should be concerned about our character before and let our character give direction to our conduct. The second of the principles of the Beatitudes: all believers are meant to manifest all of the Beatitudes. That's a very important deal. You can't look at it and go, well, I really did well with this 1 and 2. I don't do so well with these. You know, our directive, what Jesus is teaching, is that we should be focused on developing all of these characteristics of character into our life that are represented in the Beatitudes. It's essential to our Christian walk. Here's the third principle about the Beatitudes. None of these that are described here, none of the Beatitudes are characteristic or natural tendencies to us. Not any of them are natural tendencies to us. They have to be developed. It's important for us to know, and I think we all understand, that you don't work for your salvation. It's the finished work of Jesus. That's how we come to salvation. The finished work of Jesus. It's his grace that comes to us through faith. That's the means of salvation. But sanctification, our growing up, our maturing, we have to work a little bit at that. We have to be exercising the things that we learn. We have to put into practice. So these Beatitudes, again, being taught to believers, we should be working on these on a regular basis. The last principle under the Beatitudes is this. These characteristics that we're looking at here, the Beatitudes, these are the differences between believers and unbelievers. This is how you look at somebody and you say, we know them by their fruit. We know them by their fruit. We recognize them by their love. It's these characteristics that become a part of us, that come out of us, that make us different. It's the difference. Now that Jesus changes gears here a little bit, it's kind of interesting. In 13 through 16, suddenly, out of nowhere, he begins to talk about salt and light. And what I want to point out about that is that first we are what we're supposed to be, how we're growing, and then what we're to be doing. We're salt and light. We're here not to live in isolation. We're here to interact with other people. And when the Beatitudes have become part of our lives, and we've incorporated those in, then the natural outflow of that is that we're salt and light. It's just part of it. It comes with it. So what does light do in a dark room? Suddenly you can begin to see. What does salt do? It preserves, and it also adds flavor. It enhances. So that's where our calling is. That's why God has left us here when we come to faith. We have a purpose to stay. That's why we don't get snatched into heaven as soon as we come to faith. There's a purpose for us to be here, to be salt, to be light to other people. Now we see another big transition, Matthew 17, 5:17 through 20. It seems out of place to me. When I first read it, I was like, what's up with this? It's kind of like a parenthetical thought that comes to Jesus' mind. He's talking about all these things. These are the Beatitudes. And he's talking about this over here. This is the way that you should be salt and light. And suddenly he brings up the law. What's that about? Why the law? Why does he bring this in all of a sudden at this point? And it's interesting that it's critical to our understanding. We've got to understand what Jesus is saying here. So let me kind of help you get a grasp of this thing. First, in Matthew 5:17 and 18, what Jesus is teaching is that everything that he's about to say from this point on, all the way through the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, everything he's about to say is in absolute harmony with the Mosaic law, the law that Moses was given back at Mount Sinai. Everything is in harmony with what the law says. He says, I don't come to abolish the law, I don't come to abolish the prophets, I come to fulfill. So everything that he's about to begin teaching is in absolute harmony with everything that the Old Testament holds in the way of law. And the second thing, which he points out in Matthew 5:19 through 20, is that his teaching, those things that are in harmony with the Old Testament, they are in absolute and diametrically opposed to the things that are being taught by the Pharisees. This is essential. This will be part of what Jesus deals with. He'll be teaching people things that the Pharisees are saying, I don't agree with that. That's wrong. We don't like that. We don't want you teaching that. This will be where a lot of the conflict comes that ultimately culminates in the cross. It's beginning right here early in Jesus' ministry career. He concludes this section in verse 20. He says that your righteousness against teaching his disciples, your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, or you certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's making a really stark point there, that they, presenting themselves as holy people, doing it right, you have to be above that. You have to go above that. It's an interesting thing. So if there are Pharisees in that crowd, you can tell that they're not happy about what Jesus is teaching here. Now we move into some specific teachings, different things. And in your Bible, you probably have headings over each one. And they begin in verse 21. And they go through to the end of chapter 6, our Bible there, I believe. Now he's teaching in each of these, as individual little topics, he's teaching how your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So he's told them that You know, I'm in line with the law. I'm opposing what the Pharisees are teaching. Your righteousness has to exceed the Pharisees. Here's how you do it. So that's the transition that we see here. There's some phrases that come up repeatedly in these verses, and you should note these because they're very important. When Jesus says, "You have heard it said," and then he says, "But I say unto you," or "I tell you." Those two phrases, it happens 6 times from this point to the end of chapter 5. In verse 21 and 22, in verse 27 and 8, in verse 31 and 32, in verse 33 and 4, in verses 38 and 39, in verses 43 and 44. Jesus makes the same statement in each of those things. You have heard it said, but I say to you. The "you have heard it said" part is the teaching of the Pharisees. But I say to you something different. That is different than what they're saying, but it's in harmony with the law. You'll never see it written anywhere where Jesus says, "You saw it written in the Mosaic law, but now I say to you this over here." That doesn't occur. You've heard it said, you've heard it taught, you've heard the Pharisees say these things to you, but I say to you this. It's very important. It's a very important deal. The other piece of this that I didn't want to pass over quickly is that the phrase that he says, "but I say to you," is essential. From the very start of his ministry, he is beginning to say, "I am the authority. I have the ability to speak authoritatively," from the very onset. A lot of people get that confused. They say he's never claimed to be God himself. But this is not true. Biblical research would not hold on to that. So as we wrap up, just a quick overview then. So we're looking at each section as we go through, but we have to remember that every section that comes next is part of a whole. We can't pull them out and say we're going to talk about this one all by itself, absent of the rest. When we do that, we begin to take things out of context. And you've heard that occur, you've seen that occur when certain people begin to teach and they are pulling something out and they're teaching something that's isolated. We've got to look at it in the whole of what's being taught. The topics are not unrelated. They all tie together. In fact, there's a theme that runs through all of these topics that Jesus is teaching. And it's important to us to keep in mind that Jesus' main emphasis is on the attitude that's behind the action. Our attitude behind the action. That's just key in this. Okay, so that takes us now, and I know we're jumping over some things that we probably would have done last week, but we're going to go down to Matthew 5:38 in your headings. It probably says an eye for an eye. That's what we're going to pick up. But first, let me pray and ask God's wisdom before we go to His Word. So, Father, we come before you, and we do thank you for this time that we can gather together. I thank you for every man that's here. God, I pray that you would give us wisdom. I pray that you would protect me from error as we look at these passages. And Father, I just openly admit, without any hesitation, that your Holy Spirit is the only teacher. There is no other teacher of Scripture, of things that are of spiritual nature, than your Holy Spirit. You've given him to us for the purpose of teaching us and helping us. So we ask that you would release him now into this room, that he would prepare our hearts to hear your words, that you would speak through me, that he would be the one who speaks. Because if he will not show up, if he will not teach us, then there will be no learning here this evening. I openly say that without any hesitation. So we trust you for the outcome, Father. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So here we are. An eye for an eye, and then the other part that I'm covering tonight, and I'm going to move quickly on it, is loving your enemies. These are the 5th and the 6th of Jesus' examples of how one is to live out their life. The 5th and the 6th examples. We'll probably come back around and pick up the others. So in the interest of time, I'll let you read those passages instead of me reading them to you. But as I was going through them, and as I was preparing for tonight, I came up with 3, what I would consider key observations for the first part on an eye for an eye. And I wanted to focus on that one. I'm going to take a little more time with that one tonight, and then we'll move to love your enemies. And the reason for that is I think we can make many of the same understandings here in the first one that will be applications into the second one. So as we go here, these are the three things that kind of stuck out to me. The first one is that we have to understand the original intention of the Mosaic enactment. What did it mean? Why is that even there? Jesus is quoting when he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye. He's quoting something that comes directly out of the Mosaic law. You can look at it. Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:18, and Deuteronomy 19:16 through 21. These are places where it says this very thing. So what's Jesus talking about here? It's in the law, and now he's saying, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, I say this. What's going on there? Why is he doing that? Well, here's what's happened. In the years that have passed, there's about 1,500 years from the time that the law was given at Mount Sinai to the time that Jesus is here on the earth giving this teaching. About 1,500 years have gone by. In the time that's elapsed, the intent of the law, the way it was given, has now been changed. The original intention of the law was to provide a safety for the person who would be the one who injured somebody, so that the one injured could not take undue retaliation against the one who was injured by it. So it kind of draws some boundaries. It's to protect against excess. And because many times a person who has lower stature had less that they could do to protect themselves would become victimized by somebody that maybe they've injured or they've done something to, and the person who was injured has more capacity to exact revenge. The law was designed to say no more than the offense itself. That's the intent of the law. It's not to say I was doing something and I lost control of the hammer that I was hammering with, and it went flying across the room, and it hit this guy, knocked his eye out, and now the penalty is they had to hold me down and gouge my eye out to make it right. That's not the intent of the law. What was intended was the authorities, not the victim, but the authorities would look at the man and they would determine, whatever means they used, what was the value of the eye that was lost. And that would be the limit, nothing more that would be considered repayment for that. It kept people from saying, I lost an eye, and now you have to give me everything you own. You become my indentured slave or servant. But over the 1,400, 1,500 years, it had begun to change. And the law was being used to allow people, to give people the right to go beyond and above and beyond, to reach for more, to take away from people the things that they felt like, this is fair to me to do this. So that was what was going on. The Mosaic Law was designed to restrict what could be or should be repaid. It was designed to keep one from profiting from his loss. It was designed to define what justice really is and to limit anybody using their power for revenge. You know, it reminded me as I was thinking about all this, when I was in East Texas before I moved here, so this is a while back, one of my employees, his wife, was the sweetest woman you would ever want to meet. I mean, she was just as kind and loving and gentle as any person I've ever met in my life. She's driving in Tyler, Texas. She's in the car that they have a Lexus. It's a few years old, but very nice. And she's got kids, and she's distracted. One of the kids is doing something. She looks back, and what she didn't pick up on is all traffic was stopping except for her. And when she looked back, she comes face to face, right to the back of this guy's car. And I wasn't there, but she told me the story later. He gets out of the car, slams the door, he comes walking looking back around, he's looking at the car, he's cursing, he's yelling, he's angry, and she's standing there going, I'm so sorry, I've got insurance, we'll cover everything, there will be no problem with this, it was all my fault, she's owning it, on and on. And if you knew her, you'd go, absolutely, that's exactly what she did. He's getting angrier by the minute. She's exchanging their information. He gets in his car, takes off, flies off down the road, and she gets in her car. She's so upset. She comes, she's telling her husband who's at the place I'm working, and she's just in tears. The insurance gets involved. They're doing everything. The guy's got a rental car. They're fixing everything. They're going to have it restored. It's going to be fine. He's fine. The car will be fine. And then they get this letter in the mail from an attorney. And the attorney is a personal injury attorney. And the personal injury attorney sends the letter saying, my client was damaged. He's unable to work because of his stress and his on and on it goes. It's crazy. It's crazy. And they're suing them for something like 4, 5, 6 times the value of the car in the first place. It's just crazy the way that the world works. And that is what the law of Moses was trying to control. And the Pharisees had taken that and perverted it, and they made it into something that was allowing people to harm others above and beyond. Jesus is saying, you've heard it said before, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's in the law, but the Pharisees have perverted that. I say to you, don't resist someone who's evil. And that's interesting. It's totally different than what the Pharisees are saying. So what is that about? So there's some core values here. Human beings, core values that are part of the Mosaic Law. Human beings are created in God's image and are important, and they should be treated as such. There's value, intrinsic value. We should have respect for life and property. That's important to God. And there's a God, creator, sustainer, and a giver of life, and he will be the final judge. That's the intent of the core values of the law. And between the time of Moses and Jesus, things have changed. People were using the law as a license now for revenge. So Jesus is going to be doing some redefining, and he's going to give them a completely different picture here. So what does he do? First of all, he says, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Now what Jesus is not saying here, he's not teaching that we should just allow evil to run rampant. We don't care, it's just everywhere, we just keep on going with life, it's no big deal. He's not saying that. He's not saying that we should do nothing or say nothing or just kind of hide from it. What he is saying is that we should not be quick to retaliate against personal insult. That's what he's teaching here. So what's his point? How is he trying to do this? He's saying that we should be willing to be vulnerable to others. If we're kingdom-minded, people cannot be obsessed with personal rights, personal injury, or the necessity to make others pay for every single mistake. You know, it reminds me of what Paul taught in Romans 12. Listen to these words. He said, bless those that persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of lower position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, for as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So that's the teaching of Paul. So Jesus is saying, we don't resist evil. We don't pull away from those people when they've insulted us. We don't isolate. We don't cut them off. But we stay in relationship. And now, I move to my third point here. Jesus is going to give some examples of how that works. He gives 4 examples in this So before we get to the examples, I was just kind of looking online. I was curious. So I was looking online and just Googled it. It said percentage of population that would consider themselves Christian. The number 32% of the world's population fits under that umbrella. So let's assume that a lot of that is people like, well, they live in the United States, and maybe that's considered a Christian country. So let's cut it in half, or you cut it into a fourth. So if you said cut it into 1/4, that's 8%. Just as a number. Who knows for sure? So 8% of the world's population adopted the Beatitudes and lived life through that means. Would our world be different? I mean, would we experience something that's different in our world? Would we resolve a lot of social issues that are out there if we lived that way? I just have to think that we would. Jesus knows our tendency, though. He knows our tendency to discount his words, to do it differently. So he gives 4 very specific, tangible pictures. Here's the first one. It's a physical one. He said, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. And how many of you heard that growing up? I mean, my parents repeated that to me a couple of times growing up. You know, I'd be wanting to pummel my little brother or something, you know, and they go, no, turn the other, you know, I hear it over and over again. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at exactly what it means, because it's been twisted out of proportion. It's been made into something that's different. So, if you were to think that about 90% of the world's population are right-handed, and I checked that on the internet, so I can't be wrong, right? I mean, I would write to that, and it said 90%. You can check it if you think I'm right. So 90% of the world's population is right-handed. So if I were to strike somebody as a right-handed person on their right cheek, how would that be? What would I do? It would be a backhand, exactly. It's not a punch in the nose. It's not a full-out assault. It's a backhanded hit. It's called a backhanded cuff. And in Jewish culture, it was something that was used as an insult. It's something that a subordinate might do with a superior might do with a subordinate that had misbehaved or was not getting their job done. It'd be that backhanded cuff is what it's called. So it's a form of insult. It's not something that's made to hurt a person physically, where they have to seek medical care. It's not that. It's an insult. So Jesus is saying, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, if someone insults you, if somebody hits you with a backhanded cuff, turn to them the other cheek as well. So Jesus is saying, turn the other cheek. Now this is interesting. I thought about this a little bit. Here's what I think in doing that. To turn the other cheek, what does that mean? That means I'm staying present with the offender, the one who's insulted me. I'm staying with him. For me to actually turn the other cheek, I have to be in his presence. I have to be there. I can't run or write him off. It's also saying that if I'm going to be there, it requires me to be there with faith and with love and with concern for the one who offended. So Jesus' point in this part of the teaching, this example, is even in personal affront, personal insult, the kingdom-minded person is not going to retaliate. They're going to stay in, they're going to express love and kindness and understanding, even when they're insulted. Here's the second example. It's one that I would call a legal example. If any one of you, anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Interesting statement. So what is Jesus being there? Well, the shirt or the tunic was everyday clothing, and the law didn't protect it. The coat or the cloak, in some translations, was the outer clothing. And it was protected by the law. You go back and find that in Exodus 22:26. It's protected by the law. That particular verse, just to go through quickly, it says, if I borrow something from somebody and they demand my cloak, my outer coat, as kind of the collateral, thank you, I lost the word in my mind, the collateral for it, so I give it to them. Even if I haven't repaid them yet, by evening, they have to give me the coat back so that I'm not freezing at night. So it's protected by the law. So Jesus is saying that if somebody wants to sue you and take away your unprotected clothing, be willing to give them to hand over that which is protected. Is that kingdom-minded people should be willing to abandon even the things that the law protects. They should not feel like I've got to fight for these things. Here's the third teaching of Jesus. And I would say this one's kind of an emotional, it appeals to the emotional. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. So what does that mean? Well, now we know probably, most of us I think know, that it was a practice of the Roman soldiers and the Jewish people at the time Jesus was there. They were living under the oppression of Rome. Rome kind of dominated. So a Roman soldier could bump into you. You're walking someplace, you have someplace to be, it doesn't matter. He could bump into you and say, Keegan, I want you to carry all my weight. And he could start taking off his backpack and his armor and all the things that the soldiers carried and say, you need to carry it for me. And you were conscripted to do that. It was part of what was required of you as a Jewish citizen. And nobody liked that. It makes you out of your way, so they make some limitations. I can require you to go 1 mile. Now, they didn't have all the mile markers that we have, so they measured it by steps. It was 1,000 steps was considered to be the distance. So you get this picture in your mind of these Jewish guys carrying all this stuff. Some soldier who's walking beside 1, 2, and when they get to 1,000, there's not 1,001. Boom, stuff gets dropped, and they're free to go. And you can find somebody else, make him go another mile. But that one guy was done. So Jesus is teaching that if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. So what's his point here? His point is that a kingdom-minded person attempts to demand of others, or accepts the demands of others without becoming irritable or complaining or grumbling about that, even when they're not fair. That's what the kingdom-minded person. And the final one he does here, I would say it falls into the category of financial. If someone asks you for money, and then you can put, it's not here, but you can put it in parentheses as part of it, or to borrow some material thing from you, do not turn him away. So what is Jesus saying here? It's important that we would use discretion. I mean, that's important. But he's saying that the kingdom-minded person will be generous, and they'll give to others joyfully. They'll help those people that are in need. So this is the teaching. The law says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The Pharisees changed that to make it something that it's not really intended to be. And Jesus is saying that don't resist the evil person. Don't do those things that the Pharisees are saying is permissible to do. So let's move on. I want to be sure that I give time to discuss some things here too. Love for your enemies. This is kind of like the next teaching, but again, they're tied together. And what Jesus is doing here is he's teaching what he's taught already is that retaliation is not okay. And the kingdom-minded person is not supposed to do that. And now he's teaching kind of a different side of that. So the Pharisees, what they taught was that it was okay to love your neighbor, but to hate your enemies. That was the teaching of the Pharisees. Love your neighbors, hate your enemies. And Jesus is saying, you've heard it taught. It's what the Pharisees are saying. Love your neighbors, hate your enemies. I'm saying to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That's his teaching. So how do we get to this place where the Pharisees would be okay with teaching something of this nature, of hate your enemies? Well, it goes all the way back to when they were coming into the promised land. Joshua is about to lead the people into the promised land. And the direction that God gave to Joshua was that the people who inhabit the land have to be driven out. They can't remain. Now, they let them remain, but that was their directive. Drive the people out to take the land. So the way that the Pharisees had begun to interpret this was that my neighbor would be defined as anyone else who was also a pure Jew. That's my neighbor. And my enemy, even if I don't know the person, I've never spoken to him, would be anyone else who is not a Jew. That would be a Gentile. That would be a Samaritan. That's kind of a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish. It's part of the group of people up in the north that were taken off to Babylon, and they intermarried, and then they came back and resettled, and they're not pure. So you see that all through Scripture. I mean, you see it all through the New Testament, particularly, the conflict between the Jew and the Gentile. The Jews looked at the Gentiles as non-human. If they touched a Gentile, they were ceremonially unclean. I mean, it was beyond just, I don't like these people. There was hatred toward those people. It was an interesting thing, which makes it really interesting in John 4, when Jesus is at the well, and the Samaritan woman comes up and he engages her in conversation. I mean, it's just so far out of character that it's just amazing that would occur. But that's the mindset that's going on with the Pharisees. Love your neighbors, love others who are just like you, and hate everyone else. That was supposed to be taught. And Jesus is saying, no. I say, love your enemies. Pray for those that are persecuting you. So the Pharisees had taken an isolated occurrence way back there, and they created an entire doctrine out of that, an entire law. So Jesus' teaching, we see then, is in really stark contrast to what the Pharisees are saying. I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And he's teaching the same principles that he taught previously in the part we just looked at. He's teaching the exact same principles there. In the previous section, he's teaching that a kingdom-minded person, how they would or should respond to an insult, turn the other cheek. You could say that would be the negative side of his teaching, when somebody's assaulted me or they've insulted me. And now he's teaching the positive side of it, the proactive side of it, of love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. So he's bringing it from both sides for his disciples. We have to remember that Jesus' time, the Jews were living under the oppression of the Romans, so that adds to it. They're under oppression already. Pray for those who persecute you. Jesus is teaching that the kingdom-minded person should not be passive. And it's important. You know, we teach that in our prison ministry that Ted's involved in, and I've been involved in, basically others have been involved in, that passivity is not okay. And Jesus is teaching right here that we should not be passive. We should be active. We should act toward in love and in prayer toward those people who don't have good intentions maybe toward us. So that's his teaching there. His point is that we take the position of reaching toward them. The kingdom-minded person is willing to take the risk to love those who are different, to love those who disagree, even to love those that are argumentative, people who even dislike us. That's what the kingdom-minded person is supposed to do. We're to love our enemies, and we begin, when we are beginning to love our enemies like this, that's when we're beginning to love as God loved us. He closes this section by saying, this is verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's an interesting kind of way to summarize all these teachings. So as we begin to love the way that God loved, and we begin to move in that direction, and this is exactly how God loves us. I mean, in Romans 5:8, it tells us that God demonstrated his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So that's the love that we've been extended. And Jesus' teaching is that we should begin to extend that same kind of love back even to the people that are hardest for us to get along with. So what's the desired outcome? I would say that Jesus' desired outcome is that those who we consider enemies or different than us or hard for us to get along with, that as we love them in this fashion, that they would be moved toward repentance and that they would be moved toward trusting in God. So that's the outcome. So let me kind of just do some summarization and we'll wrap it up here. The Pharisees were misleading the people. Society and conventional wisdom misleads us today. If we follow the society's teaching and the conventional wisdom of our society, the things that people say, we're off track. We go off the rails there. Jesus was acknowledging that life is often unfair. I mean, he's saying that. He's saying that people will often take advantage. They're going to treat us with contempt. And that nothing's changed. I mean, when you think about it, that's what we live in today. It's the same kind of world. It's fallen, it's broken. I mean, it's exactly what was being described there. And Jesus is teaching how the kingdom-minded person should engage and react to in his daily living. Even those principles apply today. Those things from back then apply to us. So as I conclude, just a few last things here. When we have a kingdom mindset, when this is our mind, when we have the kingdom mindset, our personal self-sacrifice replaces our personal rights and our license to retaliate. When we have a kingdom mindset, our kingdom righteousness replaces our personal, individual righteousness. When we have a kingdom mindset, we are then free to love and to pray for others in any situation. We can do that even with abandon. We can trust God fully in that. When we have a kingdom mindset, we begin to look to Jesus. He was the one, who's the only one, who perfectly modeled the kingdom-minded style of living while he was here on earth. So how do we develop that? Just a few things that I want to be sure I said. First, we remember that we belong to another. We remember that we belong to another. Our lives are no longer ours. We were bought with a price. We rest in the truth that Jesus sees everything. I mean, if I am mistreated in this life, it does not go past him without notice. He has seen it, he has recorded it, he knows what's taking place, and he also knows and evaluates how I respond to that. We continue to believe that someday, in God's presence, he is going to make right everything that was wrong in this world. All the things that were done wrong to me, he will make them right. I don't know how he does that, but he does. The world, so he makes things right, and he will restore all that's been unfairly taken away. I think about Job. Job lost everything. But if you read all the way through the book, at the end, you see that God restored the things that Job had lost. And then finally, my last point is that we develop a kingdom mindset as we focus on the one perfect example, Jesus, who was willing to empty himself and come here, taking on the form of a bond servant, even going to the cross. If you think about that, we look at that as our example. Through those things, we begin to develop the kingdom mindset that empowers us to deal with all the things that come into our life. So I thank you guys. I got some discussion questions on the table. We'll get into some small groups and let you guys go look through those things. So let me close this with prayer, and then we'll go right into our discussion groups. Let's take something. Okay, so Father, I thank you for every man here. I thank you that you have given us everything we need in your written word. You have provided every direction. So, Father, I pray that you would give us wisdom, that you would convict us where we need conviction, where you would begin to show us what you would have us see, and that you would guide our thoughts, guide our footsteps, and we would walk well with you. And we would be salt and light. We would be good representatives of this world, the people that are around us. Father, I know that people here and men here are so much struggling with difficult situations in their workplace, unfair things that happen, unfair bosses that require things of them that they should not require, hard evaluations that should not be done. God, I know that in this room, statistically, there has to be a handful that go through that. So God, I pray for grace on those men. I pray that you give them an extra measure of grace as they face those difficult situations to move toward that kingdom mindset. And this is temporary. What I'm facing in this life is temporary. And a day comes, all that's wrong here will be made right. All the things that have been done that have hurt me in secret will be revealed. There will be justice at your hand, not in our hands, at your hand, sometime soon. You record everything. You see all. You know all. So, Father, help us to trust. And because of that, we are in your hands. We are in good shape. So I pray this blessing and this prayer over every man here, that you would guide our thoughts, help us to walk with you. We love you. We thank you. Father, we pray this things down in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys.
Feel free to linger. Love the groups. One thing is, a couple weeks ago, I did a follow-up note. Hey, here's what I heard. Please give me feedback. I got feedback from a few. I'd like you guys to get more feedback, okay? So we can all help each other, so people hear different things, and it helps us all a lot to be able to kind of reflect and know what's going on going forward. So thanks for a great message. Thanks, guys. Next week's going to be a big one, so be here.
That's always my strategy. When I don't know an answer, I start asking questions. Then I heard so I think and so honestly, I heard that first. Next question. I'm gonna get some water. I'll figure that out.
Do your own Q&A at home. Thanks for joining.